Hey, good morning, everybody. Hey, I wanted to make just a few comments before our worship service begins here today. First of all, I want to acknowledge that right now this is a pretty painful time for a lot of people in our country. Certainly, I know my own heart breaks. It was very heavy for our black brothers and sisters in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our country, who right now are experiencing deep grief and sadness. I would imagine a lot of righteous indignation, good righteous indignation. And then also maybe even a lot of wondering, when is it that God's justice is going to prevail in our communities? And yeah, our hearts are heavy with you. We stand with you in love and prayer. And I'm very thankful that we have a worship service today that has a lot of elements of prayer in it. I think maybe even before all this went down this past week, Pastor Cowan crafted a service that had a lot of prayer elements in it. We're going to be praying for God's healing, His mercy in our land. We are going to be confessing in prayer our own sinfulness and seeking God's mercy to renew us and to refashion us as His people. So I'm very much looking forward to praying together in worship. I also wanted to just say real briefly, so I make a few comments about the situation and in the sermon. I got a little nervous of that tonight, Saturday night. I got a little nervous of that tonight, partly because, we had to record the sermon 3 times in its entirety on Friday morning because we were having some technical difficulties here, and probably by the 3rd time I was going through it, I probably wasn't as careful as I was the first time, and so I'm not even sure exactly. Well, anyway, you'll see it when we get there. But here's the bigger issue that we're in the stage now where everybody's making comments and their official statements all over Facebook and everything like that, and we're listening to those statements with very hypercharged ears. And I want to be very clear that I don't think I give my official statement. I mean, I call it a horrible atrocity in the sermon, and that's true, very much my statement. But beyond that, I don't go too much deep into the specifics of the situation. I, more in the sermon, address what seems to me to be a very fundamental problem in our culture that our passage just happens to speak about this morning that feeds into so many of the problems, including these ones that we suffered through this past week. I just wanted to acknowledge that. Certainly, it was, as we talked about last week, the enemies of God are raging, enemies that would seek to divide and bring chaos and drag us back into darkness. And today we're going to talk about the enemy that's also inside of us too, that leads us to at times treat people who don't look like us, or who don't think like us, or act like us with contempt or disregard, or sometimes even as enemies. So we're going to be talking about that, and again, it's good for us to come and to worship the one who has defeated both the enemies on the outside and the enemy within by His Spirit, and to come and to seek that Spirit, to come to seek His mercy, and to come to seek His renewing grace in our lives. Man, I wish we could all be together so we could pray and worship and talk together face to face, but it's coming soon enough. And in the meantime, our hearts are heavy together, and we worship together. So let's do that now.
Our scripture reading for today is Galatians 5:16 through 25. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Grace and peace to you all. I mentioned last week that our sermon this week and last week, what we're doing is we're setting up our summer sermon series where we're going to be exploring together some very practical spiritual disciplines or practices, if you will, that help us grow in the grace that God gives to us through Christ. These very practical things that we see happening in the life of Christ and the life of his followers, really throughout the whole life of the church, that help God's people grow in our appreciation of who Christ is and all he's done for us, help inspire and also empower lives of faithfulness and obedience to him, and just generally help us enjoy the life that he calls us to. So that's what we're doing next week, beginning next week. This week, last week, we're kind of setting that up by, and I'm trying to make the case for why it is really important for us and good for us as a church to give of ourselves, especially this time where we, are kind of separated a little bit, to give of ourselves to understanding and putting these spiritual practices into play in our own lives. Part of the way I made that case last week was to talk about the reality of this very real spiritual enemy of God who rages against his people. Satan, this hideous dragon in Revelation 12, who is super ticked off that he's been kicked out of the courts of heaven and that he has suffered this climactic defeat on account of Christ's death and resurrection, and now knows that his time is short, his days are numbered, and so he's taking all this pent-up rage and frustration and unleashing it against the church, using whatever means possible to draw us away from deeper relationship with Christ, draw us away from the life that he calls us to. So last week we were looking at that. Well, and I'll say this too, part of the goal from last week was, if you think that, or if your strategy for standing up against the wiles of the devil is, well, I'm just going to buck up, get some self-control, get my spiritual armament on, and I'm going to, do whatever, or on my own that I can withstand the wiles of the devil. Or even worse, if you think that, okay, here's how I'm going to stand up against Satan. I'm just going to think happy thoughts, or I'm going to think good, positive, right, theological truths in my head. Well, that's good and right and stuff that we should be doing. But if that's our only plan of attack, we're going to come up short, and I think we're a little bit foolish. Rather, the name of the game is to press deeply into Christ and to the grace that he would give to us, his care, his nurture, his protection for us, which is what these spiritual practices help us to do. So if last week we looked at the enemy on the outside, today we're looking more at the enemy within. This enemy that Scripture seems to imply is every bit as dangerous, every bit as a threat as the enemy on the outside. I feel kind of like a parent who's trying to make his kids eat their vegetables and says, well, if you don't eat your vegetables, you're not going to have enough vitamins or nutrients to fight back against a cold or infectious disease. If you don't eat your vegetables, your eyesight's going to grow dim, your leg's going to fall off, and you're going to die alone. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. But I feel like I'm doing a similar thing where I'm almost sort of scaring you into seeing the worth and the value and putting into practice these spiritual disciplines. And I guess in some sense that's part of what I'm doing, so deal with it. You'll get over it. So what we're looking at this week is not just the threat outside, but now the threat inside as well too. This biblical notion that there is this fundamental problem, this fundamental brokenness that lurks deep inside my life and my heart and the members of my body that would resist the life that Christ is calling me to. And so we're going to look at this partly to talk about the importance of these spiritual disciplines to fight back against that internal problem too. But then we're also talking about it because we need to do this regularly, because as a culture, right, we're people who we don't like to look to find problems too deep inside of us. Like, we like to think more positive, happy thoughts about ourselves. We don't like to think that there's this deep-seated evil or problem that is at work in our hearts and our lives. Let me give you a case in point. Again this week the world witnessed another horrible atrocity. The death of a black man by the hands of a white police officer, killing this black man who in no way seemed to be resisting arrest or in any way. And rightfully so. Now the world, you read it, you turn on the news or you flip open your social news feeds and you see people just pouring out these deep expressions of sadness and grief, pouring out expressions of frustration and anger, crying out for justice, crying out for God's mercy upon the problems in our society. And then what often happens in situations like this too is that when we move from these raw expressions then also into people sharing commentary. Maybe they'll share other Facebook posts or we'll hear it on the news. Everybody giving their perspective and their opinion on fundamentally what is wrong in our society. So we'll see posts about the continuing prevalence of systemic racism, or the continued problem with abuses of power, or our continued tribalistic tendencies, all of which are right and very much a part of this whole problem. But what's interesting, I think, is that rarely, if ever, will you see somebody say, okay, what is the problem? What is the great evil that is plaguing our society, our communities? It's me, or it's within me. Right? That there is something fundamentally wrong, something fundamentally not right within myself that leads me away from the life that I was created for, the life that I'm being called to, and that leads me to treat with suspicion or disregard, or maybe to even treat as opposition or threats those who don't look like me or think like me or act like me or have the same agenda and plan and purposes that I have in my life. And so that's part of what we're going to be looking at today. Again, the idea is that we can be quick to diagnose and see very clearly the problems that are going on in our society out there. But we are very slow, and we're not in the habit of looking inward and seeing this great evil in the world that I am a full participant in, that wages within my own members. And that's what Paul is wanting to warn the church of here in Galatians 5, and that's what we're going to be looking at a bit here this morning. I'll say this, part of Paul's intention throughout the book of Galatians is to convince his readers, convince the church that in some way they are living in freedom in relation to the Old Testament law. In some way they have been brought out from under subjection, in some way, to the Old Testament law. And he's been making that case throughout the book. We can't go back over that. But when you come in here into the latter part of chapter 5, what he's doing now is he's saying, okay, but hear me out, or hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that in light of your freedom, now you are a law unto yourself, or that you now are charged to compose your own Bill of Rights, your own rules and procedures for how you're going to live a self-fulfilled and meaningful life. No, I'm not saying that. There is still this higher ethic, and there is this way of doing life that God's people are called to submit themselves to. So he's very concerned in this passage with how we walk. You see it there in the bookends of the chapter, or the bookends of our passage in verse 16 and then verse 25. He's concerned with how we walk and with how we are keeping step. Okay? And a concern for Paul is that we would be walking by or keeping step with the Spirit. Here's where we're going to do double duty again, in the sense that this is Pentecost Sunday. It's the day throughout the history of the church where the church has stopped to remember, to give thanks, to celebrate this great gift that God has given in the pouring out of His Spirit upon His church. And if you were just to read your way through the book of Galatians, just taking note of how Paul talks about the Spirit, you pick up really quickly that, for Paul, the Spirit is this incredible gift that's been given to the church, been given to God's people. For the Apostle Paul, the Spirit is in some ways, the ultimate experience of the Spirit is almost the ultimate experience of this great work of redemption and salvation that God has undertaken in love and His creation through the death and resurrection of Christ. Meaning, for Paul, part of what that whole salvation operation was about was restoring people in relationship with their Creator, reuniting them with their God, bringing them back into God's family. And what richer way of doing that by investing, pouring out His own Spirit deep into their lives? How can you get a much more deep union, reunification than that? Right? So for Paul in chapter 4, Spirit is not a spirit of enslavement, but it's a spirit of sonship. We're part of the family again. It leads us to cry out, Abba, Father. Or in chapter 3, Paul actually goes all the way back to the beginning book of the Bible. He goes back to Genesis, to the very first promise that was made to Abraham and to his offspring. This promise where God said, look, through you, I am going to bless all the families of the earth. And Paul looks in his own day at the pouring out of the Spirit on the Gentile nations, the Gentile, non-Israelite families. And in chapter 3, he says, there it is. There's the fulfillment of that Genesis 15 promise that was made to Abraham and to his people. This great blessing that has been given to all the families of the earth, right? So it's a spirit of sonship. It's a great spirit of blessing. Chapter 2, it's through the ministry of the Spirit that Paul enjoys new life. He will say that his life has been crucified, and so that it is no longer now he who lives, but Christ, and the life of the risen Christ that lives within him. Paul will talk about the Spirit as being the down deposit, the first fruits of our hope that reminds us that we are pressing towards this great fulfillment of new life in our own lives and throughout all of creation. So it leads us in hope. And in chapter 5, the way he talks about the Spirit here is that the Spirit is this divine power source that both guides and leads us, but also enables us to live lives of rightness and fruitfulness. Okay? This divine power source that guides and leads us in the way that is right and also enables us to live that way. So for Paul, the concern is that we are walking by the Spirit, or that we are walking in step with the Spirit, day by day, moment by moment in our lives. And here's part of the reason, or part of the issue for why this is so important for Paul, is that there is this other thing at work in our lives. Right? He calls it the flesh. And by flesh, he doesn't mean, the skin that's covering our bones, per se. By flesh, he means, this old nature, this old self, this old man, this way that we used to be, right? Okay, so we've been in some way given newness of life by the Spirit, but in this in-between time, until it is Christ returns, there's still this old self, there's still this old nature that lingers in our hearts, in our lives, in the members of our bodies. And here's the thing. This flesh is opposed to the Spirit. You pick it up. That's why it says there in verse 17 that the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. In other words, as a result of this new life produced in us by the Spirit, now deep down we have this new fundamental desire to love and be faithful to Christ. We have this new desire that we want to be obedient. We want to live lives that are pleasing to Him. Okay, but the problem is that we still have this old nature, this flesh, that is opposed to the desires of the Spirit, to keep us from doing the things that we would want to do, to keep us from living out those desires of love and faithfulness and obedience to Christ. Some of you maybe are thinking here of Romans 7, where Paul gets personal about this. And he says, I know that nothing good, this is verse 18 of Romans chapter 7, I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I keep on doing. I delight in the law of God, this is verse 22, in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. And he goes on to say a little bit later, so who will deliver me? O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And then he answers this own question. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Which then sets up chapter 8, which is this great exposition of the work and the ministry of the Spirit in the life of those who are joined to Christ. right? That it's the Spirit that sets us free from the flesh, that gives us newness of life from underneath the constraints of the flesh, the controlling desires of the flesh. And so again, in Romans 8, just like in Galatians 5 here, he'll have the same plea, same admonition, except now he uses the word live. Live not according to the flesh, but instead by the Spirit. Put to death the deeds of the flesh and live by the Spirit. So you will not go down the paths of death, but go down the paths of life. And here's this other really important part. Anytime Paul talks about spirit, flesh in his letters, what you'll notice is there's no third category of existence. What I mean by that is he doesn't say, well, you're either walking according to the flesh, or you're walking by the Spirit, or you're walking in this gray sort of fuzzy in-between thing where you're maybe not indulging the flesh so much, but you're certainly not living by the Spirit. No, for Paul, there is no middle ground. And the reason for that is that if you are not walking by the Spirit, if you are not day by day availing yourselves of this power of the Spirit in your life, you're going to walk by the flesh. Because you are powerless in and of yourself to avoid the pull of the flesh into that old nature. In other words, there's no room here for somebody who says, well, yeah, I might not be faithfully pursuing the Spirit with my life, but I've managed a certain degree of self-control, and I am putting to death myself, the deeds of the flesh in my life. No. For Paul, he doesn't have a category for that. He doesn't talk about that. If you're not walking by the Spirit, you're going to be inevitably pulled back into the desires of the flesh because it has this controlling aspect over us. And we need this external power. I'll say it this way. If you were to go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or if you were to come, Friday night to the NA meetings here at church, and you wanted to be a part of their 12-step recovery program, the very first step of that program is to come to a deep-seated realization that, okay, I have a problem with alcohol or whatever, and I am powerless against it. And as a result, my life has become unmanageable. Those are the words they use. Right? If you're addicted to narcotics and you want to find recovery, the very first step is to recognize I have a problem with narcotics and I am powerless against its control in my life, and as a result, my life has become unmanageable. Which is really counterintuitive when you think about it. Right? The first step of recovery is to admit defeat, in a way, which it is. Which is so counterintuitive to our culture. Our culture thinks the way that you find recovery and newness of life is to think positive, happy thoughts. You can do this. Come on, get control of yourself. You can do it. Anybody who's been through recovery programs understands that no, the first step is to recognize, no, I've been defeated. I can't do it. I'm powerless. My life is unmanageable, which leads to the second step of I need some source of power outside of myself to bring deliverance, to bring freedom, newness of life. Essentially what Paul's saying here, what is the church? Man, if I had a chance to change the slogan on the sign, I might change it to this. We're a bunch of sinners in recovery. We're a bunch of sin addicts still working through recovery, right? Because there still is this old nature that wars against us, and if we're not walking by the flesh, we have no power against it, and our lives would be, if we're not walking by the Spirit, we have no power against the flesh. Our lives will be unmanageable as a result of it. So why do we gather together? Why do we pour into Christ? Why do we feast on the Spirit? It's so that we can find some power outside of ourselves. That's why when we come together for worship, it's my hobby horse that we have a time of confession, right? Because any process of renewal and recommitment and faithfulness has to involve, right, this recognition that there is still this brokenness, this broken flesh which rages against the life that God would have for me within me. And I need to recognize that. I need to recognize my powerlessness against it, which leads me to greater appreciation for the Spirit, greater dependence upon the Spirit. Right, so again, that's Paul's concern here. Walk by the Spirit so that you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Okay? Got it? So here's the other part in the passage, and here's just what I want to look at in the time that we have left, is not only does the flesh resist the life of the Spirit in us, not only does the flesh seek to pull us away from Christ and from the life that he calls us to, not only does the flesh rob us of all this great stuff that Paul sees through the Spirit, right? A life of sonship, a life of participation in Christ, a life of, of hope, and right, all this. Not only does the flesh pull us from all that, but the flesh wreaks havoc in our relationships as well. Let me show you how this plays out in Paul's argument here. He goes on then in verse 19 to distinguish between the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit. All right, so starting in verse 19, we'll say, now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, brute, raw gratification of personal desires for pleasure, sensuality, idolatry. And by that we mean the willful giving of myself and worship and obedience to some other god or some other created thing. Some other created thing, money, sex, power, whatever it is that we think is the golden ticket to our personal happiness and self-fulfillment, right? Again, just this raw, brute gratification of personal desire. And then where he continues to go is you can see how then this plays out in relationships. It also stirs up enmity and strife and jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, the like. And do you see the connection here? I mean, think about it. If what animates my life and controls my life is this desire for material prosperity, and I'm convinced that that is the golden ticket to my happiness, well, then if I'm in a relationship with someone else who has significantly more material prosperity than I do and seems to be happier for some reason than I am, well, then what's going to produce in me? It's going to produce in me envy. Or we can see how this preoccupation with the desires of the self could also cause, division, the splitting apart, and the dissolution of relationships. Divide, in other words. If my primary objective is to gratify my desires, then everything else will be in subjection to that, including my relationship. So if I'm in a relationship that hasn't given me warm, fuzzy feelings, or if I'm in a relationship that isn't feeding into this healthy self-image that I'm trying to keep up, or if I'm in a relationship that, admittedly feels a little bit more like work than just for all enjoyment, what am I going to do? Maybe I'll pull back and just kind of hope that relationship dissolves and fades away on its own momentum. Or, heaven forbid, I'm in relationship with other people who are similarly ruled by a concern to gratify their own desires, their desires which may be different than mine, right? Their agendas, their passions, their dreams, which might not be the same as mine, and maybe are slightly offensive to me and to mine, or maybe in some way get in the way of mine. Well, now within that relationship, there might be a little bit of strife. There might be enmity. There might be fits of anger if you're given to emotional expressions of anger, whatever. Right, so you see what Paul's sort of saying here, that a life lived in just brute gratification of personal desire, this life lived by the flesh, not only pulls you away from the life of the Spirit, but also wreaks havoc in your relationships. And so we contrast that then with the fruit of the Spirit, which is, above all else, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. We might be missing one in there somewhere along the way. And the thing is about these, if you think about them, they are characteristics of a person not of a person who's living in isolation, but a person who is living in relationship. Right? Love, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, peacefulness, right? That implies that there are other people on the receiving end of that gentleness and goodness and faithfulness and love. Right? So that's what the Spirit does. The Spirit produces in us fruits that, build up relationships instead of tear them down. And actually, what I should have done is had Robin read, starting from verse 13, because I think in the 3 verses before our chapter, before our passage, Paul really gives it to us what his main concern is here. Let me read it for you. If you have your Bibles, follow along. He says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but rather through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. So did you pick up the distinction there? Did you pick up the contrast? Right? The concern is, okay, you've been set free, but don't use your freedom as an opportunity to gratify the flesh. So here's the contrast. Instead, live a life of love and service to others. Or, here's the point of this whole, what we're exploring here, is that another way of saying, or another way of describing the contrast between life in the flesh and life in the spirit, is to say life that is lived in pursuit of gratification of my personal desires, or life that is lived by the Spirit, putting to death the desires of the flesh, and instead, or so that I can be free to live a life of love and self-sacrificial service to others. Okay, right? Do you see that? Right? Because for Paul, this is what the whole law is about. And the whole law is summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. And for Paul, this is what the Spirit does. The Spirit writes the law on our hearts. So it's not necessarily that the law is done away with. It's instead that the Spirit is what writes the law on our hearts and enables us to be true law keepers and to actually live out the law, which is summed up as love your neighbor as yourself. So again, the contrast is you're either living gratifying the desires of the flesh, or you're living by the Spirit, which is putting to death those desires so that you are set free to live lives of love and self-giving service to others. It's this pretty powerful picture. And if we just go back to what we were talking about a little bit in the very beginning, here's the great irony in our culture. I think, at least in modern Western culture, the preeminent value or the overriding priority in life is the fulfillment of the self. Right? In modern Western culture, it seems to me that the value supreme, or the supreme value, is the fulfillment of the self, or in psychological terms, the actualization of the self, or in general terms, happiness, or the pursuit of happiness within the self. And in modern Western culture, the name of the game is you have to be authentically true to yourself. You got to do you. You got to be you. You live out your passions, and you go headlong into your desires and dreams, and you don't let anything stand in your way, and you don't let anything get in the way of you doing you, and yada yada, and on and on. And the irony for me is that we don't see how very blatantly that is clearly the overriding value of our culture. But then that would lead us, obviously, to, at best, treat relationships or social ties or engagements with other people as secondary, or as always subservient to our own desires and intentions, right? And so that leads us to naturally view with suspicion anybody who seemingly has a point of view or lives or acts or whatever in a way that might get in the way of where I'm going in my life and what I think is good in life. And then so what we do is we're seeing this all the time now. We have this tendency just to group up with other people who think like us and act like us and maybe even look like us and, who seem on the same sort of agenda and plan and are ultimately going to help me in my own progress towards self-fulfillment. And everybody else is considered other at best, or at worst is considered an antagonist to where I'm going. Someone I view with suspicion, or someone I view as a threat, maybe even somebody I view with dislike or hatred. When in doubt, quote Timothy Keller. I wrote this great book, Making Sense of God, An Invitation to the Skeptical. Highly, highly recommend it to anybody. And in it, he says this: when, as in the modern approach, you bestow significance on yourself, then your individual interests are more important than any social tie. He says the relationship is always secondary to the self-realization of the individual partners in the relationship. And then he goes on, human communities become thinned out into these lifestyle enclaves or social networks in which people connect flexibly and transiently, but only to people like themselves. They relate to one another around similar tastes in music or food or common wealth status, such as in gated housing development, but their private and public lives are no one else's business. And then he says, and this is damning, it is well documented that under the conditions of the modern individualistic self, social ties and institutions are eroding, marriage and family are weakening, society is fragmenting into warring factions, and economic inequality is growing. So in other words, when we think about, we try to wrap our minds around what happened this past week, yes, of course, there is still this pervasive problem of systemic racism. Yes, of course, there is this problem of abuse of power and these tribalistic tendencies. Yeah. But I think the diagnosis of Scripture is that it goes even deeper than that. That at base level, here's the fundamental problem that we all participate in, is that we have this flesh that would lead us, that would command us to gratify the desires, the passions, the interests solely of the self, and to make everything else secondary, subservient to that. And the diagnosis of Scripture would be that we have to recognize that we are enslaved to that. And not only is it pulling us away from the life that we were created for, the life of Christ, it's causing all sorts of problems in our relationships, in our families, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and what Paul's concerned is even within the churches. So if you ask me, what does our culture need? Well, it needs to somehow be confronted with that. And yeah, we could post about that on Facebook or, speak out about that. But all just good and important. But if you ask me, what is really needed is a church, a group of people who will live out honestly our brokenness. And live out honestly that, there is this great evil within me that resist the life that I was made for and would wreak havoc in my relationships. And yes, I am powerless on my own against it. Right? We need to be open and honest about it. We need to be willing to be, transparent about our sinfulness, transparent about this brokenness, so that maybe a culture would see that as well. I think, too, what they need is to see a group of people, a church, right, for a culture that is convinced, that is just patently obvious that the fundamental priority in life is self-fulfillment and self-happiness, right? They need to see a church, a group of people who live this other ideal, this other norm or value that says, actually, the deepest life that we are called to and created for is one where we put to death sort of selfish intentions so that we are free to live lives of love and self-giving service to others. So which all leads us to the question then, so how do we do that together as a church? Right? How do we be that example to our culture? How do we represent the truth of the gospel, the life of Christ, the life of the Spirit? Well, that's how he draws this passage to a close. He says two things. Verse 24, those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Right? As we've united ourselves to Christ and trusted our lives to Him, part of what we are doing is we are participating in His crucifixion, and we are putting to death that flesh. Right? And so, in a sense, step one is, not even step one, but every day step one is we come back to the cross. Right? We look at the cross, we meditate on the cross, we, again, let the cross sink in deep. And part of what happens when we see the cross day in and day out is that we recognize, holy cow, there's a problem here. There's a problem in my own heart and life such that it costs the life of the Son of God. Right? If there was any other way to fix this problem, surely the Son of God wouldn't have to come. But the fact is, that since the Son of God had to come and surrender His life unto death, is evidence and proof that there is this great problem which there is no other solution for, that I am powerless against. This problem of the flesh, the problem of the power and the weight and the condemnation of sin in my life. And see, when we see that, when we recognize that, that leads us in humility. It leads us to recognize, okay, there's a real problem if I ever put myself above culture and I look down on them and I judge them, because I see that, okay, the same evil that's wreaking havoc in their lives in the community is the same evil that is resident within me. The other thing that happens when we stare at the cross and we soak it in and we meditate on it is we recognize that our lives have such great value and worth to the Father. Right? That the Father was so filled with love and compassion for us that he sent the Son, who himself was so filled with love and compassion for us that he would suffer death so that we could be liberated, so that we could be set free from the power of death, the power of the flesh in our lives. And, when we, again, sit at the foot of the cross, when we see that and we soak that in, not only does that fill us with a appreciation and a thankfulness to Christ, but it also fills us with this desire to be more like Christ. We see the beauty of Christ in that, and we want to be more like that. And we want to, in a similar way, live lives of love and self-giving service to anybody, whether they deserve it or whether they are serving my personal agenda in life or whatever. Right? We want to be like Christ, who came and died for his enemies. We want to be like that, who live in the beauty of Christ, who give of ourselves in love and service to others. So we come to the cross, we see it anew. And I'll just say, too, if you haven't done that yet, if you haven't come to the cross, understood what that means and submitted your life and faith to it, there's where you start. Don't even bother with the rest of it. Just start there. That's step one, which then leads you into the rest, which for Paul is, hey, if we're going to walk now by the Spirit, which has been given to us because of the death, resurrection of Christ, well, then let's keep in step with the Spirit. And by the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the flesh. The question that's sort of being left unanswered here is, well, how do we do that? What does it look like to put one foot in front of the other and walk in step with the Spirit? There's where we're going to go, right? There's where we're going to go next week. There's where we're going to go throughout the summer. We're going to be exploring these practices that lead us into a rich enjoyment of Christ and also lead us in pursuing the Spirit and walking by the Spirit and keeping in step with the Spirit in our lives. So, this morning I hope I've done my job and in some way scared you into eating your vegetables, or just convinced you that there are these very real threats out there inside that would wage against the life we were created for, the life that deep down we know we desire, and the enjoyment of that life too. And so we dare not ever make the mistake of just kind of coasting through the Christian life and just, understanding in our head the truth of the gospel and say, well, it's great. Christ died for me, poured out his Spirit, and then we just kind of coast through life. No, there is also this active participation in Christ, this active participation in the Spirit, walking by the Spirit, step by step. And that's what we're going to explore in the summer, how we do that meaningfully and effectively together as a church. But so in the meantime, may God keep you faithful. May God make you hungry and increase in you this great hunger and thirst for the life and the power of the Spirit. And may God draw near to you with his mercy and his grace. All for his name's sake and for the advancement of his kingdom in and through us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we ask it. Amen.